It all began with a mysterious contract. I was an experienced diver, hired to explore a deep lake in the northern part of the country, where, according to local legends, a town had been swallowed by the water centuries ago. There were rumors of an ancient catastrophe that had caused the flooding, burying the entire city beneath the cold, dark waters. My employers, a team of researchers and archaeologists, believed that this forgotten place held untold secrets, artifacts that could unlock the mysteries of a lost civilization. But, as with most legends, there were darker whispers, two stories of strange creatures lurking beneath the surface. Creatures no one had ever truly seen but which no one dared to disturb. When I first heard about the job, I was intrigued. Diving into the unknown always carried a certain thrill, and the pay was substantial. The lake, known as the Abyss by locals, was infamous for its eerie silence and depth. Few had ever attempted to explore it, and none had ventured too far. There was something about the water there, they said, that felt wrong. It was too still, too cold, and every now and then, strange shadows could be seen moving beneath its glassy surface. I arrived at the lake with a small team, 2 archaeologists, a geologist, and myself. Our base was a small cabin on the shore, with all the necessary equipment to support deep dives. From the first moment, something about the place unsettled me. The lake was enormous, stretching far into the horizon. But there were no birds, no insects, no sounds of life, just the relentless, oppressive silence. The water was a deep, inky black, as if it absorbed all light and warmth, leaving only a vast, foreboding darkness. "We start tomorrow," Dr. Rivas, the lead archaeologist, said as we unpacked. He was an older man, grizzled and stern, with a passion for uncovering history. "We've mapped out the general area where we think the city lies. But be cautious. This place has a reputation." I nodded, dismissing his warning as a mere superstition. After all, I dived in much worse conditions before. But something about the way he said it, the look in his eyes, like he knew more than he was letting on, made a shiver run down my spine. That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling of the small cabin, listening to the silence outside. No wind, no animals, just the soft, distant lapping of the water against the shore. It felt almost alive, like the lake itself was watching us, waiting. Sleep came slowly, haunted by strange dreams of murky waters and shadowy figures beneath the waves. Morning arrived, and we prepared for the first dive. I suited up, double-checking my gear. The others set up equipment on the shore, monitoring cameras and sonar, while I descended into the depths. As I slipped beneath the surface, the world above vanished, replaced by the eerie quiet of the underwater abyss. The first 100 meters were uneventful, just dark, murky water and the occasional flicker of light from my headlamp. But as I descended further, the temperature dropped sharply. The cold bit into me, even through the thick neoprene of my suit, and visibility worsened. The sonar pinged softly in my earpiece, guiding me deeper into the lake. At around 200 meters, I saw the first signs of the city. Ruins, old stone structures barely recognizable as buildings, loomed in the darkness. Walls crumbled, and arches stood crooked, as if frozen in time. My heart raced with excitement at the sight. This was it, the forgotten city that had been hidden for centuries. I activated my underwater camera, recording everything as I swam through the ruins, searching for anything significant. But something was wrong. The deeper I ventured into the city, the more I felt it. A presence, something watching me. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't uncommon for divers to experience paranoia in such conditions. But this felt different. The water around me seemed to pulse, vibrating with an unnatural energy. And then I saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of my vision. I turned sharply, shining my light in the direction of the movement. But there was nothing. Just the ruins, the cold, and the endless dark. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was down here with me. Something hiding in the shadows, watching, waiting. I decided to return to the surface, my nerves on edge. As I began my ascent, I heard it. A soft, distant clicking sound, rhythmic and steady, like the ticking of a clock. It echoed through the water, growing louder with each passing second. I stopped, heart pounding. The sound was coming closer, but I couldn't see the source. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A shadow moving fast through the water, too fast for me to track. Panic surged through me, and I kicked harder, ascending as quickly as I could while keeping my breathing steady. The clicking sound intensified, and then, for a brief, terrifying moment, I saw it. A creature, long and sinuous, with scales that shimmered in the light of my headlamp, darted just out of reach. Its eyes, large and gleaming, stared at me with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in these waters. When I finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the others were waiting. Dr. Rivas helped pull me onto the dock, concern etched on his face. "What did you see?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. Not yet. The terror of what I had just witnessed still gripped me, making it hard to think. As I sat there, shivering despite the warmth of the sun, I looked back at the lake, at the water that hid the ancient city beneath its surface. Something lived down there, something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. And we had just awakened it. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in my bones. The image of those gleaming eyes haunted me, lurking in the edges of my mind. I knew what I saw wasn't just some trick of the light. There was something down there, something intelligent, something malevolent. Dr. Rivas, however, was more excited than ever. "This is incredible," he exclaimed as we reviewed the footage from my dive. "You found proof that the city is real, and whatever you saw, well, that could be an undiscovered species." I wasn't so sure. The way the creature moved, the way it watched me, it felt wrong. I had been diving in deep, dark waters my whole career, but this was different. This thing wasn't just an animal. It was something else. But the team was eager to continue. We decided to dive deeper, to explore more of the city and gather more data. I felt a pit of unease growing in my stomach, but I couldn't back out now. Not without answers. This time I wasn't alone. Dr. Rivas insisted on joining me, along with another diver, Lucas. We suited up and descended together, the weight of the water pressing in on us as we ventured once again into the silent depths. As we neared the city, I noticed something new. The ruins, which had seemed still and lifeless before, now felt different. There were shadows, shifting and moving through the buildings, just beyond the reach of our lights. It was as if the city itself was waking up, responding to our presence. And then I heard it again, the clicking sound, rhythmic and steady, filled the water around us, but it wasn't mechanical. It was organic, like the rasping of scales against stone, the pulse of some unseen heart deep within the ruins. I glanced at Dr. Rivas and Lucas, but neither of them seemed to notice. They were too focused on the structures ahead, their lights sweeping over the crumbling arches and submerged streets. The deeper we swam into the city, the louder the clicking became. I could feel it vibrating through my bones, like a distant hum, but there was something else, movement. Shadows flickered in my peripheral vision, darting between the ancient, decayed buildings. But every time I turned my head, there was nothing, just empty darkness. Then Lucas froze. His light had caught something, a figure barely visible through the murk. At first, I thought it was just part of the ruins, a statue or an oddly shaped rock. But as the beam steadied on it, the figure shifted. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, it moved, sliding back into the shadowy depths. "Did you see that?" Lucas's voice crackled through the comms, shaky and uncertain. "I saw it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Keep your lights moving. We're not alone down here." Dr. Rivas, ever the skeptic, waved it off. "Probably just a large fish or some debris drifting in the current. Don't lose focus. We're here for the city, not for ghost stories." But Lucas and I exchanged a look. We knew that wasn't just debris. Whatever it was, it had been watching us. And it wasn't the only one. We pressed on, moving deeper into the ruins, the silence around us broken only by the occasional rasp of our breathing and the distant clicking, which grew louder with every passing minute. The architecture became more intricate as we descended. Massive stone columns and twisted metalwork, half buried under centuries of sediment. It was as though we were entering the heart of the city, a place where time had stopped but something else had not. Then we saw it. At the center of the ruins, towering above the other structures, stood an enormous temple-like building, its stone walls etched with strange, unreadable symbols. The entrance gaped open like a mouth, a black void that seemed to swallow the light from our headlamps. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread as we approached, like the very water around us had grown heavier, pressing in on my chest. "We need to go back," I muttered, my voice barely more than a whisper over the comms. "There's something wrong here." "Nonsense," Dr. Rivas replied, his excitement palpable. "This is what we came for. We have to get inside, see what's there." But as we swam closer, I felt a coldness creeping over me, a sensation that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. The clicking was louder now, almost deafening, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't coming from inside the temple. It was coming from all around us. I turned, shining my light back over the ruins we had just passed, and my heart froze in my chest. Shapes, dozens of them, moved in the darkness, their sleek, scaled bodies gliding silently through the water. They were massive, their forms twisting and undulating with an unnatural grace. Their eyes, cold, gleaming eyes, reflected the light, staring at us from the shadows. "Rivas, Lucas," I gasped, barely able to force the words out. "We're surrounded." Both of them turned, their lights sweeping over the swarm of creatures that now circled us. They were like nothing I had ever seen before. Long, eel-like bodies covered in shimmering, dark scales, their mouths lined with sharp, needle-like teeth. But it was their eyes that terrified me the most. They weren't the eyes of mindless animals. They were intelligent, calculating, and filled with a hunger that made my skin crawl. Lucas swore under his breath, his light trembling as he tried to keep it steady. "What the hell are those things?" "I don't know," I replied, my pulse pounding in my ears. "But we need to get out of here, now." Dr. Rivas, however, was frozen in place, his eyes wide with fascination. This is incredible," he muttered. "An entirely new species. We have to document this." "Forget the documentation," I shouted, panic creeping into my voice. "We're in danger." But before I could finish, one of the creatures darted forward, moving with terrifying speed. It was almost too fast to see, a blur of black and silver as it shot toward Lucas. He barely had time to react, his light flashing wildly as he tried to dodge. The creature snapped at him, its jaws closing with a sickening crunch just inches from his arm. Lucas screamed, his body jerking backward as he kicked furiously, trying to put distance between himself and the monster. "Go! Go!" I yelled, grabbing Dr. Rivas by the arm and pulling him toward the surface. He resisted at first, still trying to film the creatures with his underwater camera. But when another one shot past us, its tail brushing against his leg, he finally snapped out of his trance. We swam as fast as we could, the creatures closing in around us, their clicking now a relentless cacophony in the water. I could see their shadows darting through the ruins, their eyes glowing like tiny lanterns in the dark. They were herding us, driving us back toward the open water, away from the temple. For a brief moment, I thought we might make it. The surface was within sight, the light of day filtering down through the murky water. But then Lucas screamed, a high-pitched, blood-curdling sound that sent chills down my spine. I turned just in time to see one of the creatures lunge at him, its jaws clamping down on his leg. Blood billowed out in a thick cloud as he thrashed, trying to break free. "Lucas!" I shouted, swimming back toward him, but it was too late. The creature pulled him down into the darkness, his screams fading as the water swallowed him whole. I froze, horrified, but Dr. Rivas grabbed my arm, yanking me upward. "We can't save him," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to go." Numb with terror, I followed him, my mind racing. We broke the surface a minute later, gasping for air. The others on the shore rushed to pull us out, their faces pale with confusion and fear. "Where's Lucas?" one of them asked, but I couldn't answer. All I could do was stare at the dark, silent lake, knowing that whatever was down there wasn't finished with us yet. That night, I couldn't sleep. Lucas's screams echoed in my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw those gleaming, predatory eyes watching me from the depths. We were supposed to be safe on the surface, but I knew better now. There was no escaping what lay below. Dr. Rivas, however, was undeterred. That night, sleep was a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lucas's final moments. His body thrashing, blood blooming in the water, and those cold, unblinking eyes watching from the shadows. I felt trapped, as if the walls of the small cabin were closing in on me. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from that cursed lake as possible. But Dr. Rivas had other plans. The next morning, while I sat at the kitchen table in a daze, nursing a cup of coffee with trembling hands, he paced back and forth, muttering to himself. His excitement from the previous day had only grown, despite everything that had happened. He was relentless, driven by a manic need to uncover the truth. "This is the discovery of a lifetime," he said, barely able to contain his enthusiasm. "We've stumbled upon a species no one has ever seen before. Do you understand what this could mean? We have to go back. Go back." I could barely believe what I was hearing. "Are you out of your mind? Lucas is dead, Rivas. We barely made it out alive. Whatever's down there, it's not just some new species. It's dangerous." He waved me off, dismissing my concern. "It was an accident. We were unprepared, that's all. But now we know what to expect. We'll take more precautions. We'll be ready this time." I stood up, my body tense with anger and fear. "You didn't see what I saw. Those things, they were hunting us. They're not some curious animals. They're intelligent, and they're protecting something." "Exactly." Rivas's eyes gleamed with a fervor that chilled me. "They're protecting the city, the temple. Don't you see? That's why we have to go back. There's something there, something they don't want us to find." I shook my head, feeling a deep pit of dread in my stomach. "You're insane. I'm not going back down there." But Rivas wasn't listening. His mind was already made up. "You don't have to," he said, his voice suddenly cold. "I'll go by myself if I have to. But think about it, this is our chance to make history. Are you really going to walk away from that?" I wanted to scream at him, shake him until he understood the gravity of the situation. But instead, I turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving him to his madness. I needed air. I needed to think. The lake was deceptively calm as I stood on the shore, staring out over the water. A thin mist hovered just above the surface, the kind that made everything seem dreamlike and distant. But there was nothing peaceful about this place. It was a trap, and we were caught in its web. I didn't notice the boat approaching until it was nearly at the dock. A small fishing vessel, manned by a single figure. The man, an old local we'd seen a few times since we'd arrived, climbed out with the ease of someone who had lived by the water his whole life. "You should leave," he said, his voice rough and weathered like the wood of his boat. He didn't bother with pleasantries, just stared at me with cold, knowing eyes. "This lake is no place for outsiders." I frowned, his words cutting through the fog of my thoughts. "What do you mean?" He cast a glance toward the water, his face tightening with something that looked like fear, or maybe anger. "The town under the lake, it's cursed. Always has been. The people there, they were different. They dabbled in things they shouldn't have. And when the water came, it swallowed them whole. But they didn't die, not like they should have." A chill ran down my spine. "What are you saying?" He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "The creatures you've seen, they were people once. But the lake changed them, twisted them. They're not human anymore, but they remember. They remember what's down there, and they protect it. They won't let anyone take it." I took a step back, my heart racing. "You know about them? I've lived here my whole life." the old man said, his gaze never leaving the water. We all know, we stay away from the deep parts of the lake. Some things are better left buried. I opened my mouth to ask more, but before I could, he turned and climbed back into his boat, pushing off the dock with a practiced motion. Take my advice, diver. Leave while you can. The lake doesn't let go easily. As he rowed away, disappearing into the mist, I stood there, frozen, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy fog. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags and never looked back. But the allure of the unknown, of that dark city beneath the water, was too strong. It pulled at me, whispering promises of discovery, of secrets long forgotten. I returned to the cabin, my mind swirling with thoughts of the old man's warning. Dr. Rivas was still there, sitting at the table with maps spread out before him, lost in his own world. "You're coming, aren't you?" he asked without looking up. I hesitated for a long moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a stone. I could still walk away. I could leave this cursed place behind and never think of it again. But something, whether it was curiosity, pride, or sheer madness, made me nod. "Yes," I said, my voice hollow. "I'm coming." The dive that afternoon felt different. The water was colder, more oppressive, as if the lake itself was aware of our intrusion. The surface world slipped away as we descended into the dark, leaving only the silent abyss around us. We had brought more gear this time, stronger lights, harpoons for protection, and a small submersible drone to explore the temple without putting ourselves at risk. But even with all the precautions, the sense of dread hung over us like a shroud. The city emerged from the gloom as we descended, its twisted buildings standing like sentinels in the dark. But this time there was movement everywhere. The creatures were out in full force, gliding between the ruins, their eyes glowing like tiny embers in the water. They didn't attack, not yet, but they watched us closely, circling like sharks. We made our way to the temple, the massive structure looming before us like a tomb. The entrance was as dark and foreboding as before, but now it felt almost alive. The water around it seemed to pulse with a strange energy, and the clicking sound that had haunted us since the first dive grew louder, more frantic. "Send in the drone," Rivas ordered, his voice tight with anticipation. I launched the drone, its lights cutting through the black as it floated toward the temple entrance. The screen on my wrist displayed the feed, showing the inside of the temple for the first time. The walls were covered in strange symbols, like the ones we'd seen outside, but more intricate. The floor was littered with debris. Bones, I realized with a jolt, old and yellowed, scattered across the stone like offerings. "What the hell is this place?" I muttered, my hands shaking as I guided the drone deeper. Then, the drone's light caught something, a large stone altar at the center of the temple, and on it lay a massive, twisted object, something that looked almost organic, covered in a thick layer of sediment and algae. "It's a relic," Rivas whispered, his voice trembling with excitement. "It must be ancient." But as the drone moved closer, something shifted in the water. The creatures, which had been circling outside, suddenly stopped. Their clicking grew louder, more erratic, and they began to converge on the temple entrance. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice rising in panic. But Rivas didn't listen. He was transfixed by the relic, his eyes wide with awe, and then the water around us exploded with movement. The creatures surged toward us, their sleek bodies slicing through the water with terrifying speed. Their eyes gleamed with a feral intelligence, and their jaws snapped open, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. I barely had time to react before one of them lunged at me, its tail whipping through the water like a spear. I dodged, kicking away just in time, but another was already closing in from the other side. The water churned with their movements, a chaotic storm of scales and teeth. I fired the harpoon, the sharp tip slicing through the water, but the creature dodged effortlessly, its eyes locked on me. "We have to leave," I shouted through the comms, my heart pounding in my chest. "Rivas now?" But Dr. Rivas was frozen, staring at the drone's screen in disbelief. The relic on the altar, whatever it was, had begun to move. The thick layer of sediment that had covered it for centuries was shifting, as if something beneath it was waking up. Dr. Rivas stared at the screen, transfixed as the relic on the altar shifted under layers of grime. His breathing was ragged, the excitement in his voice barely masking the underlying fear. "It's alive," he whispered, his words thick with awe. I couldn't afford to process his madness. The creatures were closing in, and I was running out of options. One of them lunged toward me, jaws snapping inches from my face. I barely managed to push it away with the butt of my harpoon gun. But there were more of them now, circling like a pack of wolves, waiting for the moment to strike. "Rivas, we need to leave. Now!" I screamed, firing another harpoon at one of the creatures. It missed, disappearing into the inky water. But Rivas didn't move. His eyes were glued to the screen, his voice trembling with reverence. "Do you understand what this means? This is the key to everything. We've discovered something beyond our wildest dreams." I could barely hear him over the clicking, now deafening and chaotic, like a chorus of nails on glass. The creatures were getting bolder, darting closer with each pass. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to swim as fast as I could toward the surface, but I couldn't leave Rivas behind. I grabbed his arm, shaking him violently. "Forget the relic. It's not worth our lives." But before I could pull him away, the relic on the screen jolted violently. The thick layer of muck and algae slid off, revealing something beneath. Something large, grotesque, and pulsating. A massive, fleshy mass, veined and slick with decay, sat on the altar, its shape shifting in a way that made my skin crawl. It was alive, but it was wrong, an abomination that shouldn't have existed. The clicking from the creatures around us reached a fever pitch, and then, all at once, they attacked. I barely had time to react. One of the creatures rammed into me, knocking the harpoon gun from my hands. Another darted toward my legs, its jaws snapping closed around my calf. Pain exploded up my leg, a searing, burning agony that made me scream into the comms. Blood billowed out into the water around me, a thick red cloud that blinded me as I thrashed, trying to shake the creature off. I kicked furiously, managing to dislodge its grip, but more were coming. I could see their shadows darting toward us, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. I turned, desperate to find Rivas, but he was still staring at the drone feed, oblivious to the danger. His breathing was rapid, and his hands trembled as he pointed at the screen. "It's waking up," he whispered, and then something happened that made my blood run cold. The mass on the altar shuddered, expanding and contracting like a grotesque heartbeat. The walls of the temple, covered in ancient symbols, began to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsing from within the stone. The water around us seemed to vibrate, as if the entire lake was alive, responding to whatever was happening inside the temple. And then it spoke, not in words, but in a deep, guttural sound that echoed through the water, reverberating inside my skull. It was a voice, ancient, powerful, and filled with a hunger that made my chest tighten with fear. I could feel it inside me, probing, searching, its presence vast and malevolent. The creatures around us froze, their movements halting as the voice echoed through the ruins. They no longer seemed like predators. They were subservient, waiting, listening to the command of whatever had awakened. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what was happening. The creatures weren't the ones in control. They were merely guardians, servants of something far more dangerous. Rivas was muttering incoherently, his eyes wide with terror and wonder. "We've unleashed it," he said, his voice cracking. "God help us, we've unleashed it." I grabbed him by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "We need to leave, now." But before he could respond, the water around us surged. The creatures that had been circling us scattered, disappearing into the ruins like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Something massive was moving inside the temple, a dark shape that writhed and twisted as it began to rise from the altar. The green light pulsed faster, casting eerie shadows over the ancient city. My body went cold with terror. Whatever was inside that temple was waking up, and we were directly in its path. I didn't wait for Rivas to snap out of his trance. I grabbed him by the arm and swam as fast as I could, dragging him with me. My legs screamed in agony with every kick, blood streaming from the wound, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The surface felt impossibly far away, the weight of the water pressing down on us as we ascended. Behind us, the deep, guttural sound grew louder, more insistent, and the water began to churn violently. I could feel it, something massive rising from the depths, something ancient and terrible that should have stayed buried. Rivas was barely keeping up, his breathing ragged and panicked. "It's coming," he gasped. "We've disturbed it. We're dead. We're all dead. Shut up and swim," I shouted, pulling him harder. The surface was closer now, the light from above faint but visible through the murky water. But just as I thought we might make it, something wrapped around my leg. I screamed as I was yanked downward, my body jerking violently as the creature dragged me back toward the depths. Rivas's face twisted in horror as he tried to reach for me, but I was being pulled too fast. The creature's grip was like iron, its scales rough and cold against my skin. I kicked desperately, trying to free myself, but the more I struggled, the tighter its hold became. My lungs burned as the surface grew farther away, the light dimming as the darkness swallowed me. I thought this was it, that I was going to die in the cold, black waters of the lake. But then, through the haze of pain and panic, I saw it, the temple. The mass inside it had fully awakened, its shape twisting and undulating with an unnatural, grotesque rhythm. And in that moment, as the thing inside the temple opened what I could only describe as its eyes, I felt something worse than fear. I felt it looking at me. It wasn't just a creature. It was something ancient, something that had existed long before the city had sunk into the lake. And it was hungry. With a final burst of strength, I kicked at the creature's grip, my hand fumbling for the knife strapped to my thigh. I slashed at the thing holding me, feeling the blade bite into its flesh. It recoiled, and for a brief moment, its grip loosened. That was all I needed. I kicked upward, every muscle in my body screaming in protest as I clawed my way toward the surface. The light grew brighter. The water around me churned with unseen forces, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. Finally, I broke the surface, gasping for air as I was pulled onto the boat by the others. The lake roiled beneath us, as if the water itself was angry, but I didn't look back, couldn't. We left everything behind, our gear, the cameras, even Rivas's precious research. None of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was getting away from that cursed place. It's been weeks since that day, but the nightmares haven't stopped. I still hear the clicking in the silence of the night, still feel the cold, dark water pressing down on me. But the worst part isn't the memories of the creatures, or even of Lucas's death. It's the feeling that something followed us. Something that woke up when we disturbed the ruins. I can feel it, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, watching, and I know, deep down, that it won't stop until it finds me.